Good morning and welcome to the State Water Resources Control Board's Water Quality Fee Stakeholder Meeting. My name is David Ceccarelli and I am the Chief of the Fee and Revenue Branch. I will be facilitating this meeting alongside help with my lead manager in the Fee and Revenue Branch, Glenn Osterhage. Complying with COVID-19 emergency safety guidelines, today's meeting is being held remotely via webcast and Zoom. I do want to mention just kind of off the bat, I've got a few things I wanted to discuss. There on the webcast, there may be a slight delay, so just be patient with us on that. On February 11th, the meeting handout was sent out through the Water Board's fee regulations LIRIS list, along with instructions on how to participate through the Zoom platform. And I encourage everyone that hasn't signed up for the LIRIS list, please do so. You'll receive occasional notifications on our fee regulations. The handout is also posted on the Water Board's fee webpage, and that address is www.waterboards.ca.gov/resources/fees/stakeholder. Individuals attending via the Zoom will have the opportunity to ask questions or provide comments during the open discussion part of our meeting. If you are joining through the webcast, you can submit a comment or ask a question by emailing the fee branch which is on the screen there, which is feebranch@waterboards.ca.gov. Again, I just want to repeat that. It's feebranch@waterboards.ca.gov. Today, we have many of our fee branch staff working behind the scenes to ensure that your experience is as few participation bumps as possible. If any time throughout this event you find that you are having technical difficulties, please email the fee branch@waterboards.ca.gov. And I just want to acknowledge a couple of our fee staff that are behind the scenes today. Sarah Fong, who is navigating through the system and the Zoom system and monitoring the emails. We also have Itzi Abeda, who is new to the fee branch. She's one of our new fee managers and just started with us a couple months ago. And so this is her first stakeholder meeting, and she'll be participating more in our process. And you'll be hearing from her more as we get through the fee stakeholder and the fee setting process. Again, we thank you for joining us virtually today. We thank you for your patience as we move to 100% virtual meeting space. We're doing our best to ensure everyone can participate in an effective way. So let's go over just some of the guidelines. Remember to use the handouts that were sent via the email. If you don't have the handouts, don't worry. We'll be sharing the documents on the screen. You can request a copy of the documents after the meeting. And again, our handouts are also posted on our fee webpage. Remember, if you have any technical issues, email us again at the email there under number 2, feebranch@waterboards.ca.gov. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. And remember, you can submit comments and questions throughout the event by sending them to our fee branch, waterboards.ca.gov. And again, staff will be monitoring those as we go along. And then if anybody, I know that we sent out instructions through the LIRIS list. If anyone is joining us and did not send an email to us, please do at this time. And we'll have staff go ahead and take proper steps on that. Before I review today's agenda, I just wanted to highlight the purpose of today's meeting. This is our first of 3 stakeholder meetings as part of the fee setting process for fiscal year 21-22. Water Code requires the State Water Board to adjust the annual fees each fiscal year to conform to revenue levels set forth in the Budget Act. Staff review all waste discharge permit fund program fees on the annual basis and hold several stakeholder meetings throughout the year that will coincide with the various iterations of the governor's budget. Today, we'll be discussing the budgetary expenditures on the waste discharge permit fund from the governor's proposed budget and how these expenditures impact our water quality fee programs, highlighting the cost drivers from last year's budget to the governor's proposed budget. At today's meeting, since it's early in the fiscal year, we're still determining our current expenditures, revenues, and fund reserve. So we will not be presenting any details of potential fee adjustments for each of the programs. We'll be in a better position in June to discuss our fee adjustments at our future meetings. We'll have follow-up meetings in June to discuss the May revised budget, and finally a meeting in August to review the enacted budget. Staff's goal is to present a fee structure to the board for consideration and adoption at the September 14th, 2021 board meeting. In addition, I wanted just to recap the adoption of the fiscal year 2021 water quality fee schedule and how those impacts, how that impacts the 2021-22 water quality fee schedule. At the September 16th, 2020 board meeting, the Water Board adopted a fee schedule that generated approximately 75% of the required amount from most programs in fiscal year 2021, with the remaining portion deferred to fiscal year 21-22. This option that was adopted generates sufficient revenue to support expenditures, increases related to BCPs, plus a portion of projected revenue shortfall, and would require the Waste Discharge Permit Fund programs to hold some positions vacant to achieve a savings in 2021. As we get into the cost drivers agenda item, we'll discuss these deferrals. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to review the agenda. So of course, right now we're in the welcome and introduction portion. Number 2 is the Waste Discharge Permit Fund budget cost drivers, which is attachment 1. We'll also go over the Waste Discharge Permit Fund program budget details, which is going to be attachment 2. And then we'll go over some potential fee changes that staff are working on internally, and also some upcoming stakeholder meetings on some of these items. And then we're going to kind of split off in some way, and we're going to have a cost of compliance discussion, and this is going to be led by the Division of Water Quality, and it's going to be led by Karen Mogus, the Deputy Director of the Division of Water Quality. And then finally, we're going to have some next steps and some open discussions to kind of conclude our agenda. So at this point, I'm going to move it over to item number 2, which is our Waste Discharge Permit Fund budget cost drivers. And I'm going to move this item to Glenn Osterhage.
Thank you, David. And as a way of introduction for anyone who's participating on Zoom, although I think I know everyone who's on the Zoom platform, but those on the webcast, I am Glenn Osterhage, as David introduced, the branch manager for the fees. I do want to state, if we can go ahead and put the agenda back up real quick before we go through the first attachment. Item number 5, as David mentioned, the cost of compliance that will be presented by the Division of Water Quality. That actually, we will not start that one should our meeting go pretty quickly until 10 o'clock. One of the key participants for that discussion item is not available between 9:30 and 10. So if items 1 through 4, obviously, if we go over an hour, we'll be on schedule, but it ends early. We may just take an extended break waiting to start the cost of compliance. So if you're solely here just for the cost of compliance, do know we will not start that before 10 o'clock. Thank you for that. And we can go into number 2, the first attachment. This is a new format for the water quality program. Those of you who have participated in the water rights or drinking water, this layout has been used for those programs, so we're trying to make it consistent through all of our fee programs. In a way, we did show some of this information last year. It was just part of the next slide, but we broke it out as a kind of a summary to quickly show what was the budget that we set fees for last year, what's the current proposed budget we're looking to set fees for, what that difference is, and then obviously the percentage change. And then what we call on the second table, the cost drivers for that change. So the WDPF, the Waste Discharge Permit Fund, is going up roughly 7% from what we set fees on last year, potentially, and I'll get to that in a moment. And then we break that 7% down in that second box. So the cost drivers of normal state operations. I'm going to get into that removal of furlough salary savings in just a moment. We do have one BCP in the January proposed budget. It's related just to the stormwater program and specifically the industrial side, and we'll get into that again in a moment. There is a minor reduction in a prior year BCP related to the water quality Cert program for wildfire mitigation, and then there's pro rata. So those are the primary drivers of the change in the budgets from what we set fees for last year and what we're looking for this year. So the biggest one in there is what we titled the removal of furlough salary savings. It is adding about $7.4 million into our fee numbers that we have to generate, roughly 4.5% change. And what that is, for those that remember, last year it was negotiated through the governor's office and finance with the unions that all state employees would take a pay cut for up to 2 years. There has been some communication that the revenue in the state may be sufficient enough that the furlough salary savings may go away, which for fee setting processes means there's more cost. So when we set fees last year, we'd anticipated those savings to extend into the second year. There is a chance that those savings may not be there anymore going forward. So we're listing it here. Depending on the negotiations, again, with the governor's office and the unions, if furlough salary savings stay in place for the second year, that $7 million goes away again, so we don't have to worry about setting fees. But there is the possibility that that's there, and we were not anticipating that last fall. The other big one is the pro rata. This is one that we've been working on adjusting for a number of years now. We have no control at our unit onto what costs there are. There's a formula that our budget and our accounting office use to prorate the costs through the different funds in the water boards, and they're working to mitigate or change that. So there is some increased costs there. And then the final chart down there, it was just showing up as a representation from last year. As David had indicated in his opening remarks, the board adopted a fee schedule that did not generate the full revenue needed to support all staff. And so we call it a deferral. Anytime we don't raise fees the full amount, we roughly did about 75% of what was needed. Those costs carry over to a future year. So representation wise, we did realize there was some carryover costs from last year, plus the normal increased costs in operations. Both of those together roughly would anticipate about a 10% fee increase if all of those pieces remain in place. So before I move on, David, do you have anything you want to add on to this one before I take any questions?
Just to kind of highlight again on the pro rata side, we get direction from the Department of Finance on how to spread those costs. And the direction that we've gotten over the last couple of years is that it's a lot of it's based on the number of staffing that are in each of the funds. The water board gets a total amount of pro rata, and then through working with the Department of Finance and then looking at each of our funds, the number of positions. So it's basically like a pro rata based on the number of staff. The WDPF has one of the programs of the water board, or one of the funds of the program that supports the higher number of staff compared to some of our smaller funds. So it does take a little bigger portion of the pro rata cost.
And as we normally do through most of our meetings, we want it to be open dialogue. So I will open it up. If anyone on the Zoom specifically, you can raise your hand if you have any questions, or those of you on the webcast. And again, there may be a delay depending on your connectivity speeds. If you have any questions, go ahead and raise those now, and then we'll go on to the next item. So I'll give it a moment, primarily for the webcast, to see if anything comes through. My staff, Sarah or Itze, will let us know. But anyone on the Zoom, if you have anything you want to bring up now, let's go ahead and take any questions. And as we wait, we always have a chance when we wrap up our discussions, we'll do an open table. So those of you that may not have questions now, we can always come back to this item a little bit later. So I see Debbie Webster. I see one hand up. So Debbie, go ahead and I don't know. Yeah, go ahead and unmute. And what's your question, Debbie?
Sure. You had mentioned that some programs at the very beginning, that some programs had taken a that they had some of them had taken bigger hits than others on what was deferred. Is that what is shown in that bottom box there on the programs, that part?
Yes. So we basically increased fees last year based on BCP impacts, and different programs had different impacts from those BCPs. Primarily the WDR and the NPDES program took a bigger portion because 2 of the adopted BCPs were specific just to those programs. Other BCPs went across all programs within the WDPF. So some programs had a different ratio of their fee increases. The biggest one on here is the Water Quality Cert, also known as the 401 Cert program. It has a higher deferral because it didn't have that's bad English there. It had very little basis on the BCPs adopted last year, and it had a higher requirement for needing fees last year, but they weren't changed. So the ratio is different by program depending on how we raise fees.
Let me do just a follow-up question. So within each of those programs, was there differences on how, like, some permitting programs would have not deferred and some would have? I mean, is this very generalized, or for example, on the WDR program, did every single type of permit type have that 2.9 deferral? That's what I was trying to make sure I was understanding.
Yeah, so if I get this right, yeah, each what I call the sub-programs within the programs, all the different pieces, yes, it was across the board. We did not do target increases. The easiest one to do would be like stormwater. There are times when we may say just the industrial is going to pick up a larger portion of that. But the BCPs that were in play, if it was charged to WDR, all WDR fee payers picked up the same percentage increase last year, which by default means they have the same percentage deferral.
Okay, thank you.
And I see Bob Gore have your hand.
Yeah, a quick question. The cost drivers are up about 6.8% overall. Then when we go to the next chart, which you just briefly showed, the WDPF programs, some of the categorical fees are up twice that much. WDR 11.7, WQC 401 certs up 16, stormwater up 12.7. If the cost drivers were up 7%, perhaps when we get there, you can explain the difference, the increase above and beyond 7%.
Yes, we will go over that on the next slide.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm only seeing Debbie and Bob's hands raised. I don't know if anyone else on Zoom has any questions now, or if we have any email questions yet.
So Glenn, let me just say a quick word while we're talking about BCPs. You'll probably notice that we have very few BCPs this year. And the industrial stormwater discharge compliance is actually a holdover or an implementation from a legislative BCP that was implemented last year. So that was by design by the administration. The administration, because of COVID, wanted to take kind of a station keeping approach to the budget this year. Very few augmentations, just hold things steady as it were. So that's why you're not seeing a whole lot of BCPs this year. And then while I'm talking, one of the things that I'm always asked is, well, what's on the horizon? What's that, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years out? We don't really know, but I don't think it's any secret that the governor is very interested in climate change and particularly how it impacts the drought. The drought is, it hasn't been raining very much, and forest health, particularly forest fires. That's been a major topic in the news lately and in the budget discussions going forward. So we don't know exactly what those are in terms of the water board role, but that's probably going to be one of the things that you're going to see us being more active in is forest health, climate change, and drought measures.
Okay, thank you, John. And I do have to note that apparently my video is not working. It was on earlier, so I apologize for the fact that you can't see me when I'm speaking. So something happened on my camera there. So Debbie and Bob, both of you still have your hands up. I don't know if you just want to go ahead and put your hands down if you're done, or if you have any follow-up questions.
This is Chuck White. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I had raised my hand here, but somehow you didn't recognize it was up, but I'm here. I had two questions. I think they're both pretty simple. Part of the problem, I haven't given much thought to this in a while, so I'm just trying to catch up. The pro rata that you talked about, that's basically to cover other extraneous California government costs, like the governor's office and this kind of thing that isn't directly funded. So to the extent there's a portion of your program covers those kinds of other costs. Do I have that basically correct?
Yes,
Yes.
David, you want to take that one?
Yes, that's correct. It basically pays for all kind of central services that every organization at the state, is affected by. So example, for the water board, Department of Finance, controllers, governor's office, treasuries, all kind of the primary, departments help pay for those costs. So yes, Chuck, you're correct there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. The other question I have is related to that smaller square box on the bottom of attachment 1 related to deferrals. And I didn't quite get it. I guess it's when it says prior year in parentheses, that means the prior year to FY 2021. And I still don't understand what implications that table has with respect to possible fee changes in this upcoming cycle.
Okay, so I'll take the first part of your question there. I think the paren information, I should not have put that in there. It is a little confusing because we're actually talking about fiscal year 21-22.
Right.
And our lingo makes the current year the prior year. So
I got it.
You can strike that out. It's probably redundant information that's not needed.
Got it.
And as far as the deferral, so by the board decision to not fully raise fees to cover staff, the decision was made that certain number of positions would be held vacant last year because we had issues of not knowing exactly what our fund balance was going to be. So not fully funding last year, there is some costs that carry over that we would have to raise fees on separate from any type of changes in the budget. Most people understand the budget's going to go up by a certain percentage each year. So this is an amount that we knew we were going to increase fees that would be added on to any budgetary changes that we see currently in the January proposed budget. Did I answer your question, Chuck?
Well, I think so. So this table and the preceding table will all be explained in how it impacts going forward on the table on the next page. Is that correct?
Yes, there's a lot of different pieces that get added together, but this is kind of a summary. So without anything else, without looking at our revenue numbers, just looking at the budget, I interpret this as saying fees on average would go up about 10%. 6.8 because of budget changes, and 3.2, again, these are just averages. Those two are not really additive, but for argument purposes, you can add those two together and say, you know what, without even looking at revenue or fund balances, we're short about 10%.
Got it. And just to go make sure I'm clear on that bottom box there on attachment 1, that's basically positions that were held open to save funds for last year's budget, but now you will be wanting to fill them. Is that correct going forward?
Yes,
Correct.
Yes. So normally we would recommend to our board to raise fees to cover staff that's been authorized in the budget. So yes.
Got it. Sorry, I'm a little slow here, but I'm just trying to catch up.
Nope, that's why we're here. Go ahead, David.
And I was just going to say, I was looking back at the adoption process back in September, and we were asked to bring several different options to the board. One which was staff's recommendation was to fully fund the WDPF, but as a result of COVID was one of the primary reasons at the time, and some of the uncertainties that were going on at the time, that and to try to kind of keep costs down and keep our fees down. The option that was adopted by the board was to hold a number of positions vacant. As a result, it did provide some savings last year, but we did know that it would result in a deferral of cost into this fiscal year. And we wanted to be transparent and show this. And then as we move forward through the process and we start having these discussions with with our board members and our executive management, we'll lay out what it's going to take to kind of fully fund the entire program. And then this is kind of the beginning steps of that process.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we do have one email question. So I don't know if Sarah or Itse, if either one of you are going ahead and read that one.
Okay, from Bruce Howdeshelt from the Northern California Water Association. The first question is, have we been provided the pro rata as part of past year's information? And the second question is, how would BCPs to forest programs be allocated across WDPF programs?
So I'll take the latter part on the forest. I believe the BCP for that one is not related to the WDPF. It has a different funding source. So we'll have to check that one because I'm only aware of one BCP that impacts WDPF fee payers, and that's related to stormwater. So like John, you're going to jump in there.
Oh yeah, there is not a BCP per se for any forest activities. I was just saying, I always get the question, what's coming up on the horizon? What can we kind of plan for? But typically, if there is a BCP, we'll identify a set of fee payers for that. We had a forest health one the other last year or a year before related to utility power lines. And the utilities ended up being the electrical utilities ended up being the fee payers for that one. So whenever we get a BCP, we identify the set of fee payers that are most appropriate to that particular BCP.
And Bruce, the first part of your question, yes, we have included pro rata in the past. We had a couple of years ago, I believe, through a negotiation, we actually deferred pro rata from one year to the next year. But there's also been a change in the methodology on how they allocate pro rata across the water board funds. So yes, we have included pro rata. It does fluctuate from year to year. David, is there anything else you wanted to add on the pro rata for Bruce?
No, I think that's about it. It is one of our key cost drivers. It's clearly identified in the budget cut sheets that come out that are on Department of Finance's website that list, of course, all of our expenditures, and then there's a line item for pro rata. So we take that off of that, and then of course we put it into these spreadsheets to review with the stakeholders.
Okay, so Bruce, if you have any other questions, go ahead and send them. I see Sharon, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Sharon.
Yes, hi, this is Sharon Green with Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. I also had a question that relates to the prior year deferral numbers. I'm a little bit confused as well. I was looking back at the handout from the last year's last stakeholder meeting, which I believe was in August, and so I was trying to compare them, and just taking as an example the NPDES line, I was thinking that what this would be the difference between the 10.8% that was the quote full increase in option C and the 9.3%, which was option B, which was adopted, which would have been 1.5%. And instead it's the 3.8, which also appeared in the option B table. So can you just break that down a little bit? I mean, I don't mean to be so picky, but at the same time, these are starting to be pretty big numbers.
Yeah.
when you multiply them out.
Yeah, so I actually did that number myself, and to be honest with you, I don't have my calculation in front of me. So let me take this offline and validate this. I got to make sure which column I did the subtractions from, or what analysis. So again, if there was an error, I'll correct that and distribute it out. So again, I did it, so I just can't remember exactly which tables I used when I put that chart together.
It looks like these numbers, based on at least a couple of them, well, actually all of them, it looks like if you go back to that handout, I guess it was page 8 in the August 6th handout, it looks like it's the BY plus 1%, which was, the following year. And so it looks like those are the numbers that you were using in this table.
Yes, let me take a look at that.
Okay.
Looking at, I may have used a different option, so it may have just been an error on my part. So let me look at that. Obviously, we're not looking at making any projections on actual fee changes here.
Right.
So if it was an error, I'll correct that and we'll send a revised one out.
Well,
what I will say though is that our to kind of fully fund our program last year, looking at without I'm going to say this without looking at the cannabis program, we were looking at all the other programs. We needed to generate approximately about $10 million. And the option that the board adopted generated about 75% of that. So about $7.5 million, which basically then deferred about $2.5 million in costs, which also meant for us to achieve that, we needed to hold a number of positions to achieve about a $2.5 million in savings. Without kind of looking at the individual percentages, it was roughly about $2.5 million that was being deferred over into this fiscal year.
Right. Okay. I get that.
Okay.
It just, I think my main point was it looked like the BY plus 1%, which I don't think you did, you moved them in here inaccurately, Glenn. I think it increases, it says it has a general 2.5% increase in other costs. So it looks to me like it's basically sort of like an inflation, type increase plus the deferral, but I might be wrong. I had one other question that maybe sometime during the meeting you can address, which is, have you ever gotten a handle on what the reserves are? Because it doesn't look like that. I mean, I know that last year you said you don't have a handle on it. You don't, you're sort of flying blind or whatever with respect to that. And I don't see it in this year's handout either.
Okay.
Thank you.
So what I'm hoping for is last year we were pretty much about a year, and at one point we were 2 years behind on getting our financial numbers. At one point we got to about a year and a half. So as it stands right now, what we call prior year, which is the fiscal year 19-20, we hope to have the final year numbers into us sometime in March, so next month. If that's the case, then our prior year will have actuals. We'll be able to update that. Once our accounting office does finalize year-end close for the fiscal year 19-20, they are fairly quick on doing monthly reports. So starting with July, August, September, that they should be able to, I'm hoping at least get through March. I'll have that data in hand prior to our June meeting. So what that means is I'll have 9 months of actuals for current year, and that only leaves 3 months of projections. So I'm hoping that by the time we get to the June meeting, we'll have a fairly good estimate of where our reserves are going to be based off of prior year actuals and current year numbers, with a 3-month forecast. So we hope to be in a better position come June for all of our funds to wrap in. If our fund balance is healthy, that gives our board some options on fees, at least what they want to do. If our reserves come in below what we target as our minimum balance, we'll have to make that up. So there is a big uncertainty, but we hope to have better data come June. David, anything you want to add?
No, that's correct. That's what I was going to mention, that we're driving to our June meeting and working towards having those expenditures and revenues, which will then put us in a position to identify what our projected fund reserves are.
Yeah. So to summarize, we are in a much better position than we were last year. Even last August, when we last did a stakeholder meeting, we had just gotten the 18-19 numbers. let alone have anything for the 1920 year. So now we hope to be in a better shape here come the June meeting. So I don't see any other hands raised. I haven't got any message from staff that have any email questions. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next attachment. So this is the standard one that we presented on the water quality side for a number of years. We've kind of condensed it down a little bit. The first thing I want to mention is the bottom information on the BCP. We will be updating our handout with the link to the Department of Finance website. We normally have that in here. We didn't have it for this handout, but those of you who are familiar with the Department of Finance website, they have a page for budget change proposal and finance letters. You can go into the water boards section. There are 5 BCPs, only one that applies to the WDPF. So staff who are actually on site are trying to get that link that they can show through the services here. If they have it available, to pull it up. If not, again, we'll update on our website with the link that you can go to specifically for all that documentation. I don't know, they're navigating around here, so I'm waiting to see if they actually pull up that BCP or not. If not, then we'll go back to attachment 2. So we'll give a moment for staff to navigate around here. So Sarah or Itze, if you guys are navigating around, I don't know if you're trying to pull the BCP. If not, if you can go back to attachment number 2, please.
I think they're pulling it up right now.
Okay. So hang tight for just a moment. They're trying to get that link up for that BCP. Okay, so they just pulled it up. So this is the actual BCP, and again, we'll provide the link. But there's a number, it's 12 pages long. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but it's for $951,000. 6 positions. It's related to the Stormwater Industrial Program. It's going to start, I believe, down the LA region and then roll out to the entire state for more documented information. So if you have any questions specific to this BCP, we can go over that. We do have Karen Mogus from the Water Quality Program on the technical side. But again, this charge is only going to be borne by the stormwater industrial side. The intent is new enrollments because of this BCP, the revenue will actually pay for the staff. So long-term, we're not anticipating any costs being borne by existing stormwater fee payers, but the program itself will have additional costs. It's just a matter of getting those enrollments in place and having that revenue stream become permanent.
And I do want to mention that there could be we're reviewing it. There could be a slight, fee adjustment to cover the initial cost of the BCP. But as Glenn mentioned, the plan is that new enrollments will come in and they'll start balancing out the program cost and to cover the cost of this BCP. But of course, there isn't there's an initial upfront workload of getting the actual regulations and the permit enrollment and things like that into the program, which and enforcement of the program, which is basically supporting the workload of the 6 permanent staff.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and go back to attachment 2. Okay, so now we're back to our normal, I want to change my screen here, document that we've presented for a number of years for this program. So the layout here hasn't changed. Column B is what we set fees for last year. Column C is the BCP. You can see that entire $951,000 is into the stormwater program. D is all the adjustments, and I know Bob Gore, I think, had to jump off here. He had the question of why these numbers are so high, and we'll get into that in just a moment. E is where we net out is, okay, this is what each program's allocated budget. So it has, all the program costs, it has all the normal indirect and overhead costs, it has all the foundational program costs. So that's the roll up that we need to collect revenue for. F is our current forecasted revenue. These numbers could change as we get closer to June. We'll review all of our revenue forecasts. Obviously, if the revenue forecast is a higher number, there's a lower fee increase. If the revenue numbers get lower, it's a higher increase. So we want to make sure we're as accurate as possible in those forecasts. G is just the difference between forecasted revenue and the allocated budget. I, and this is where now Bob's question is, these numbers are a lot higher than people were anticipating. Most programs are around, well, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them are above 10%. A couple of them are in the higher single digits, and then land disposal is around 3%. And then currently for future years, we're still showing roughly about 4% increases in future years. That comes more in play once we start talking about if we're going to defer any costs from one year to the next, and any of those things will get pushed off to future years. So the biggest change on this one relates to the cannabis program. If you look at column B under cannabis, cannabis is roughly a $16.7 million program when it includes all of the budgetary costs for that program, plus all the redirected and indirect costs that get put into the program. Most of you who have been participating in our fee conversations for a number of years know that we have not raised revenue on the cannabis programs for various reasons that are outside our initial control. So the cannabis program is really been underfunded. And last year, the board made the decision to hold a number of positions vacant related to cannabis. 35 positions specific to the cannabis program, and another 20 positions across the WDPF, primarily on what we call foundational program positions. So 55 positions were required to be held vacant as the result of revenue having to stay where it was and not being increased. The board also then decided to hold another 10 positions open for other programs that they did not raise fees. So I'm going to kind of go off into a little rabbit hole here, but normally when we set our numbers in our fees, we set based off of the budget appropriation. And I do want to state that the actual budget itself for the WDPF is for the entire fund. We do not actually get a budget that says WDR gets X dollars, land disposal gets X dollars. That's just an internal exercise that our programs staff work on with our budgets to identify where the normal workload is going to be year to year. And then we set revenue to match the budget. So in a normal year, we set our revenue to match our budget so we can fund all positions. The cannabis program, for going on its third year now, revenue has been significantly below all of the expenditure costs. So what we're doing this year is actually I'm going to use the term right size, or we're going to force the cannabis expenditure to be lower than what we've gotten as far as budget allocation, because we can't staff that. So in reality, cannabis goes from a $16.7 million program with all costs rolled into it, which is column B, to a $4.5 million, which is column E, which matches our revenue number. So we're making a cannabis, for budgetary and fee purposes, a much smaller program. And our redirected foundational costs are redirected through all of our fee programs based off the size of the program. So with cannabis becoming a smaller program based off the revenue restrictions, the other programs are in effect having to cover more foundational program costs. The flip side of that, the argument is going to be, well, we don't want to pay for cannabis. Prior to cannabis existing, the existing fee-paying programs paid all of foundational costs. With cannabis coming on board, they took a fairly large portion of all those costs into the cannabis program, which allowed the other programs to have a smaller share. So all this really means is that we're going to set cannabis their proportional share based off of the revenue number, not the program size, because we cannot staff currently. So it gets really tough to describe this without sitting down in the numbers. But that's why column D, the numbers for most programs are higher this year, because we're forcing cannabis to be a smaller program to align with the revenue to support existing staff. The cannabis program right now is funding 19 positions. It's authorized for 54. So that's the 35 difference. Of the 19, based off of revenue numbers, 14 are program staff. 5 positions are paying for foundational programs. So that's the 19. They can afford 14 program staff and 5 other program staff for their proportional share. The cannabis program currently is staffing all 19 in the program. So in June, we'll have more data, but 5 foundational programs are going to be held vacant as a result of the cannabis revenue. So it's a long-winded story. I'm going to pass it over to David. I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add on that one, but this is the biggest change this year is we're making cannabis a smaller program.
Yeah, exactly. And we've basically kind of just internally just kind of did a forced savings at this point. We are internally looking at potential adjustments to our cannabis fees. So nothing that we're going to discuss today, but if we do, of course, make those adjustments, we'll be able to generate additional revenue, which then help support more of the cost of the cannabis program. So definitely more to come on that. If there's some decisions made that we are moving forward on some of those adjustments, we're going to hold an individual meeting with some of the cannabis stakeholders, have more kind of one-on-one discussions with them, and of course get program staff involved in that process to help cover some of the staffing workloads and the cost associated with that program.
So what that means, what David just said, is if we do get the ability or authorization to increase fees or to generate more revenue, column E and F for cannabis will become bigger numbers, and they will actually pull some of those staff cost adjustments back to the cannabis program. So as the cannabis revenue increases, it will continue to start pulling back more of the foundational costs from the other programs. So again, it's just a timing issue of when we're allowed to do that. So I did see a hand go up. Paul, you got a question?
Yeah, just in terms of what you said, are you saying that the other programs are subsidizing cannabis then?
No. So that was one of the things we stated many years ago, is the non-cannabis programs are not going to pay for the cannabis program. By the fact that we're, go ahead, Paul.
I thought that was the case, but when you said pull those monies back, or however you phrased it, what did you mean by that?
So it's all on proportional size. So each program proportionally will take a piece of what we generally call our foundational redirected costs. So a program like confined animals, CAF on this chart, which is a $5.7 million program, it has a smaller percentage of the entire WDPF. It gets a smaller percentage proportion of all the other costs. So what's happening with cannabis is we're actually going to set our budget requirement to the revenue number. Normally we set the proportional to the budget number. So we're forcing ourselves to make cannabis a smaller program. By making it a smaller program, it by default will take less of the redirected or foundational costs with it. So on the surface, I will say it does sound like other programs are paying for cannabis, but in reality they are not. It's just a proportional sizing issue. If we were allowed to raise fees for cannabis to the full amount authorized by the BCP last year, we wouldn't have this conversation. But we're in essence making cannabis a smaller program. It'd be the same thing if we got a negative BCP for any program to reduce staffing. It would become a smaller program, which means it gets less of the redirected costs. So yes, on the surface, it sounds like you're paying for cannabis, but in reality, you're not.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions then. So when you say foundational costs, you're talking like spreading overhead, correct?
Yeah, so we have the quote unquote foundational programs or basin planning, TMDL. We have monitoring programs. Those are familiar with SWAMP and Gamma. There's an enforcement portion. And then we have a number of other redirected. We have our fee staff that charge directly to WDPF. Those are just redirected as a proportional share. But the primary foundational programs, which is roughly about 30% of the fee, is being paid for by all fee payers.
I personally, I would still claim that a redirection of those foundational costs or overhead costs is a subsidization, but that's my perspective.
Yes.
The other question I have is, because I do believe this relates to this overall, when you look at cannabis and the fact that it's not completely being funded, what isn't being completed, what's being left undone? And if it isn't being left undone, how is it being funded?
So I know Scott Couch, you jumped on here. That's a program question, or Karen, if either one of you could jump on board. There's a lot of monitoring, there's a lot of enforcement, there's a lot of inspection work that's just not being done. Again, we are authorized to have 54 positions statewide for that program. We currently have it staffed at 19. So enrollment review, monitoring reports, there's a lot of activity, a lot of enforcement work that's not being done for the staff. So again, I'm going to give a moment to see if Karen or Scott, if either one want to weigh in on the cannabis and what staff is doing. I see Scott on there.
So could you, let me make sure I understand what the question is. Is it the funds have been reduced for the cannabis program, so the amount of work is less? Is the question what is not being done that was being done before?
Correct.
Okay. So we had what I would call a severe cut to the budget for the cannabis program. We reduced staff both at state board and at the regional boards. And depending on which region it was, you had some staff that were doing enrollment and other staff that were doing enforcement and inspections and things and different things in the field. So some of the regions are down to one staff, and others are down to a handful of staff in there. So we've had to relook at what they're able to do in terms of enforcement, both for illegal grows or for what we call compliance enforcement, and also in the field inspections. Part of that was being cut back by COVID, not going out and seeing folks, but some of the in the field inspections are being done now. But we've really just had to look at how many staff are available at each region and what that region can do versus what maybe we can help with at state board. We are issuing the notices of applicability to do enrollment. We're transitioning that from regional board staff to the two state board staff that I have in that unit. And so that's one thing that's being done. We're also not doing it at most of the regions. We're not doing what we called compliance inspections. And we're moving to enrollment enforcement, where we are hoping to encourage more people to enroll by doing enrollment enforcement rather than the compliance enforcement. So it kind of depends on which region you reside in as to what duties have been changed for those guys. But it is based on how many staff were redirected from those regions, how many they were left with as to and what we thought that they were able to keep doing. But it's really, a lot of it is on the inspections and in the field type work that had to be cut back the most.
Thank you.
And anything else, Paul, before we move on?
You know, I have a general just comment. It relates to what Bob Gore had said. There's kind of a question in it. And I would say it relates broadly to this. So in our region, we cover quite an area, 1.2 million acres, and we're heavily involved in the water quality side of things and others. And we've had studies done that show, as an example, that background nitrates are anywhere from 40 to 50% relative to MCL. We figured 25% of the pumps have other constituents of concern that are more naturally occurring. So when you look at things from a holistic standpoint, a lot of the issues with water quality are background, but yet all of the cost of this ends up on the shoulders of the farmers. And just as all these costs increase, it really creates a burden. So if there's ways to look at this more holistic and those other things that feed into it and find other ways of dollars to contribute to lower the impact on farmers, that would be good. And we do have studies that support that. That's just kind of a comment.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I think Chuck, you had either had your hand up or you submitted some email questions.
This is Chuck. Yeah, no, I think the previous question answered my question. I just wanted to know what was going missing with the reduction in the cannabis program, and I think you pretty well answered that. Thank you.
Yeah. And, one of the, item 5 on the agenda is cost of compliance. I think the focus is going to start on the stormwater program. But one of those issues we'll look at, what are all the costs being borne by the permit side of the house that are separate from the annual fees? Because we do realize that all costs matter to everyone. So that is something that program is going to start looking at, is the cost of being under compliance within the permit coverage. So we'll give it a moment to see if there's any other hands get raised for Zoom, or if we have any email questions. I haven't got any notice that we have any email questions.
Yeah, there are 2 email questions.
Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, from Bruce Hadashelt. Do foundational costs remain at about 1/3 of the total costs?
Yes, roughly. The cost for those programs, there's been no augmentations for number of staff, or what we term, PYs. It's just the normal salaries for those programs. Any contractual portions, those haven't changed. So I'm not aware of any new increases for contract amounts. Those are pretty stagnant. But yeah, roughly, and it'll vary, but it's roughly about, I'd say about 30%, 1/3 is roughly the ballpark for those costs.
Okay, from Lee Kamerick from Rural County Representatives of California. Do you have any insight why these cannabis program activities are not being transferred or are otherwise a part of the larger cannabis consolidation BCP proposed by the administration?
I am not, I don't have any background on that. Again, I'm going to pass it off to Scott. He may be more familiar with the statewide issue.
So the consolidation that's happening with the new, I think it's the Department of Cannabis Control, where it puts the Bureau of Cannabis Control, the CDFA's Cal Cannabis, and I think CDPH into one bureau. The reason that they did, well, I'm not speaking for the governor's office. My understanding of why those 3 were consolidated into the Department of Cannabis Control was because those are the 3 licensing agencies. So they're the ones that give you a license to either grow or sell cannabis products. Our permit is not a license to grow or to sell. Same thing with Department of Fish and Wildlife. They have a stream bed alteration agreement if necessary, and theirs is not a license either. So I believe that's the reason for those 3 being consolidated into Department of Cannabis Control. And I'm sorry, what was the initial, was there a different question as part of that? I thought maybe there were two questions, but
I'll read the whole question again.
maybe I
Do you-
answered it.
Do you have any insight why these cannabis program activities are not being transferred or are otherwise a part of the larger cannabis consolidation BCP proposed by the administration?
Yeah, well, I think if I got that right with the BCP, it involves the consolidation of those three entities into the new Department of Cannabis Control. So it's really different activities. They are licensing, growing, or selling cannabis products. Department of Fish and Wildlife and Water Board staff, they are permitting activities to protect water quality. They don't authorize you to grow cannabis. They don't authorize you to sell cannabis. It's the doing BMP measures for the grow area.
All right, thank you, Scott. Sarah, any other questions?
Bob, if you're on, did you want your question asked or not? Okay, I think he emailed you and David, so you have that, but you can move on.
Okay, so to summarize here, because this kind of ties into the previous slide, where we have budget changes going on. On the previous slide, it was about 6.8%. We had some deferrals. Again, I'll have to verify, was I using the correct chart from what was adopted last year from the different alternatives. But this one actually does throw in projected revenue numbers. So with all those moving pieces, cannabis, as we're trying to show the transparency of the fact that we're going to make it a smaller program. If we are allowed to increase revenue on the cannabis side, it will pick up, again, a proportional share of the foundational costs. So column I, the numbers are quite large. We had anticipated probably in the 7 or 8% range with what was carried over last year with additional costs. But with furlough salary savings, we took that out. We're setting the fee, or we're not setting the fees. We're showing the budget. The budget does not include any salary savings reductions in there. So there's a lot of moving pieces. Hopefully we'll get better direction from the governor's office or Department of Finance as it relates to negotiations and salary savings. If there's any spring finance letters that get added in as it relates to the WDPF, those will show up in the May revise, and we'll go over those in June. We'll continue to monitor or adjust our revenue forecast numbers. But there's a lot of moving pieces that have changed since we went to the board back in September. And then the piece that we addressed earlier is we're hoping to actually know what our fund balance is. We tend to target a 4 or 5% reserve balance for this fund. Where are we? We hope to have a pretty good idea when we talk to you guys next in June. So David, before I move on to just a couple of other talking points, anything else that you think we need to bring up here? I do see Sarah raised her hand, so we'll get you in just a moment, Sarah.
No, I think you covered everything. I was going to mention also just the furlough savings. I think that's playing a big part in these percentages. Last year, of course, the negotiations were that, staff take it's about a 9% increase in their salaries and benefits, but that related into keeping the cost down, which we were able to pass on to our fee payers. The way that the direction was at the time, there were some triggers in there based on our revenues, but it looked like that the furloughs would be in play for 2 years, which would be moving into this year, which were some of those discussions that we looked at some of our deferral costs moving into, or what our kind of potential costs were moving into this year. But when the January budget came out, that our salaries were put back to those full amounts. So again, there is no furlough savings at this point, not stating that, when the May revise comes out, that those may be, put back in, we don't know yet. So we'll see what that happens. The other thing I wanted to mention, and of course, this is out of our control when we talk about our staffing costs, are that kind of prior to COVID, that there were some agreed upon increases to salary costs. Some of the unions have negotiated some from 2.5% to 3% increases to some of our staffing levels. Technical admin staff were involved in that. Of course, those increases did not go through last year, and they're not in the numbers currently. Of course, that's all kind of negotiated through the unions and the legislators and worked through the Department of Finance. But those are not in these numbers at this point also. So I just kind of wanted to make sure that that information isn't in here. If you were kind of going back and kind of tracking kind of salaries and the kind of negotiation process and prior to last fiscal year. There may be a potential, of course, as we go through this budget process, that there could be some negotiations that take place, which builds on the cost of our salaries. So I just kind of wanted to mention that and highlight that.
Okay, thank you, David. And Bob, before we have you jump in, because I see you join us again, I do want to let everyone know that column I, that percentage increase, this is based off of fully staffing. So again, the board last year made the decision to hold some positions vacant for a number of different reasons. Whether or not they entertain that again for this coming year is another conversation, but that percentage assumes full staffing with the exception of the issue with the cannabis program. Bob, go ahead. You have some questions?
Yeah, real quick. Column I being a worst case scenario is well done. That's good to know. I'd rather have it backed off than get worse. But for the June meeting, when we have some May revise numbers, when we have a better idea about the fate of the deferrals, which I understand, we need another chart, with all due respect, that shows what, again, a clear explanation of why the fees are going up disproportionately. Because if we weren't subsidizing, the other 7 programs weren't subsidizing cannabis, then cannabis was subsidizing us. That would appear to be the lay explanation, but we need to fully understand I understand why cannabis is ratcheted down, but we need to understand that impact. And I respect the fact that it's complicated, but for us lay folks, if you could make it simple, say towards the end of May, it would be appreciated.
Yeah, so the biggest driver on that is for the last 2 years, I believe the number, David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it was 20 non-cannabis positions have been held vacant for 2 years running now. Because of the revenue shortage. But the fact that we're going to change cannabis down to its revenue number, and if the board decides to fill those vacant positions, that's really where it's coming from. But yeah, we will have a better chart. Those that were involved when we went to the board in September, we had all of our options. We showed this is the number of positions that are going to be held vacant. I do hope to have a similar type document, if it's not the same layout, something very similar that will show some of those impacts.
So yeah, so we'll work on something, Bob. Be able to kind of paint more of a clearer picture as we move into the June meeting.
Okay.
Any other questions, Bob?
Nope.
Sarah, I haven't got any notice, any email that we need to go over.
No emails right now.
Okay, I don't see any other hands currently raised. So we're going to move on. If we can put the agenda back up, please. We're going to move on to agenda item number 4. This section is actually going to be a very quick conversation before we move over to the cost of compliance. So what we call potential fee increases, we listed a few here. The very first one, 4A, is we call the winery fees. Those are familiar that the board adopted a winery general order recently. With that adoption, we will be having a stakeholder meeting for those impacted fee payers. It is now on, I believe, March 15th. to go over some different mechanisms to set a fee for that new enrollment type. So that is something that most likely we will go off cycle and take to the board right now in May to put in a winery specific fee, although it may get deferred to June. So that one, something will happen pretty soon as it relates to the winery, because again, we have a new adopted order in place and we will be meeting on that one. The next one down for stormwater, this is just a heads up. There's a few items that program is assessing as to what may change. Some of these may actually happen this year. Some may get pushed off to a future year. We're just listing these out here. We haven't actually gone into any detail with our conversations with the program, but for some examples for construction, right now there's a cap. If there's 150 acres for that permit, you max out the fee. There might be some discussions of raising that cap up a little higher. The B2, the NONA, the notice of non-applicability, currently when someone submits the request for an NOA, they do not pay any type of fee, and staff is spending time reviewing those documents. So we're going to look at potentially requesting a one-time fee related to that particular workload. It's not very significant. There's not a lot of these, but again, staff does spend time working on those, but right now there's not a fee for that. The industrial side, I think it was about 5 years ago, we did an outreach with core industrial stakeholders looking at changing the fee. Right now, the industrial program is a flat fee. It's a one size fits all. If you're a very small little footprint, you're going to pay the same as a very large facility. So again, we may open the door to some discussions of putting in some tiers, whether or not it's just based off of the number of acres that are out there, uncovered acres, I should say, or if there's some type of surcharge for certain types of activity. But again, we're going to open up that discussion. And then the NEC, the no exposure certification. Currently, there's an application fee of $150 and an ongoing annual fee of $150. So we're going to discuss most of the work for that is on the upfront certification. So we may explore maybe increasing the application from 150. I'm just making up numbers here to say 200. And then lowering the annual fee from 150 maybe down to 100 or some other number. So maybe structure it to where you pay a little more upfront because that's where the staff effort is, and you pay less on an annual basis because you're basically recertifying every year that you still have no exposure. So those are just some of the items in stormwater. It's very early. We just wanted to bring it out there just in case we do decide to move forward. That some of these may happen this year. And again, some of these may be carried over to next year or a future year.
I thought all your numbers were made up.
I try my best, Bob. The problem is if you make it up, you got to remember what you made up. So everything I talked about last September, I have to remember what I did in September. And then the final one down there is C. This is the NPDES, specifically related to section dredge mining. So there is a order out there. I think it's under review right now or waiting for comments. But there is a potential that we may recommend a separate type of fee related to suction dredge mining, whether or not it's just a one-time fee that you recertify on like a 5-year basis. So every time you submit a report of waste discharge, you're going to pay this fee, but you do not pay an annual fee. Or is the work of such that we should actually implement a specific annual fee for that workload? Again, it's early in the process, but we may come to the board with a separate fee for that particular type of activity. So I just want to go over that quickly. Those are some of the items that we're currently looking at. It doesn't mean nothing will happen to our other programs. We spent a lot of time last few years on the Ag Lands program. It took us probably 4 or 5 years. And we finally proposed a change that got adopted last year. So we do have a lot of other activities that are happening out there. These are just the ones we're highlighting right now. And I do believe we got an email question.
No, there were no email questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. I read my text wrong here. So I'm trying to read text and talk at the same time. Apparently I can't chew and ride a bike. Anybody online or if anybody has any email questions, we just want to go over that real quickly before we move on to the cost of compliance topic. So we'll give it a moment just to see if we get anything.
I don't know how to raise my hand, but I know how to speak.
Oh, it's Bruce. I don't know, Bruce, you got to wait. Before Bruce goes, we do want to state that the next meeting, and this is kind of the wrap, it is on June 10th, I believe, maybe June 11th. But it will be in the second week of June. We'll it's part of our announcement. So go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, at that meeting, will program staff be able to give an update on irrigated lands programs that are being adopted? Because as I've said in past years, it feels like the Central Valley is supporting other areas that don't have irrigated lands programs, but need staff funded. So will we get an update in the June meeting on the status of North Coast and other areas?
Yeah, we can talk with Brianna. I know that, they have to wait for those regional boards to move forward with their orders or their waivers, depending on how they have it written up. But yes, Bruce, as you're aware of, Central Valley pays the biggest share. And by the way, we just generated your invoice yesterday. So be prepared to get your big whopping invoice that you always hate to see every year.
$1.2 million, right?
I think you're higher than that now.
Great.
So yeah, we'll check out with program to see if there's any type of update of when. So this goes into those listening in. If there's new enrollments, some of the ag programs in the regions have not been developed. When they do get developed and their acres get enrolled, that's new revenue that will offset the other fee payers within that program. I can't remember which region it is. I think it's our region 6 that has like 400,000 acres, or maybe it's region 1. There is one region out there that does have a fairly decent number of acres that are not currently in the program that will eventually get enrolled once they get their order in place. John, I see you popped in. Did you have something you wanted to state before we move on?
Yeah, just a couple things. Yeah, Region 3 is also working on there. I think it's Ag Order 4.0, they call it. So that'll be add more acres too, probably. I just wanted to say my usual, we've talked about a lot today, but if you have any questions that you've thought of after this meeting or you want to get a hold of us, don't hesitate to email or call David or Glenn or myself, and we'd be happy to do any one-on-one discussions that we need to do. That was all I had. And to thank all of you for coming. This is
for me.
I just, we would much rather talk to you all in person, and this is sort of a stopgap measure, but thank you for taking time out of your day to spend a little time with us.
All right, thank you, John. David, anything that you want to bring up before we hand this off to Division of Water Quality and the program side for their topic?
No, I just echo what John just mentioned. If anyone has any questions or follow-ups after this, or as Bob mentioned, if there's other information they'd like for us to provide, we'll definitely look into it if we can. What we're more than open to. So please, don't hesitate to reach out to one of us. With that said, I think we'll move on to to agenda item number 5, which is the cost of compliance, which is going to be led by Karen Mogus of the Division of Water Quality.
I can't see myself. Can you all hear me? Oh, there we are. Okay,
There you
I guess
are.
I needed to start talking. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us and sticking around after the fee discussion to talk about cost of compliance. There's 3 topics on our agenda today related to cost of compliance. But before I go over those, I did want to give just a quick sort of summary of where we've been with cost of compliance and where we are now. Bob Gore has turned on his video. Thank you, Bob. He has been my partner in crime in pulling together the agenda for the discussion today. And he will be actually teeing up a couple of the conversations on our agenda. But really quickly, one of the comments that we received over a number of years running up to our biggest effort related to cost of compliance was that, yeah, we have to pay these fees. They're expensive. We don't want to have them go up every year. But really the biggest costs of compliance are things like monitoring and special studies and conducting analysis for constituents that we remain in compliance with over the years. So a lot of the discussion at these fee meetings running up to about the 2011, 2012 timeframe was, let's not just talk about fees, let's talk about costs of complying with the orders once they're in place, both statewide and regional board orders. So back in that timeframe, 2011, 2012, there was a big effort to evaluate our resources, our revenues coming in, what programs they go to. It was called the Resource Alignment Report. It is still available on our website if you want to check it out. A lot of the data is outdated because there's been lots of changes and additional programs added to our water quality programs and others. So it definitely, it's a 10-year-old report, so obviously outdated, but actually a really nice analysis of our resources and how they're spent and how they cover program areas like the foundational programs that don't generate revenue, but provide support to all of our programs. So that initiated the conversation about just resources in general, but then also this cost of compliance. And not long after that report came out, there was a big effort to identify stakeholders who could help us evaluate ways we could reduce costs of compliance in our major program areas. And those areas were NPDES wastewater, NPDES stormwater, waste discharge requirements, so non-NPDES discharge permits, and irrigated lands. And I would argue that those 4 stakeholder groups had a wide range of success in analyzing their costs of compliance and identifying ways to reduce costs. And the one that was most successful was the NPDES wastewater group. And I'm happy to provide the links to these. Again, they are all on our website, and all of the meeting notes from those stakeholder meetings and the recommendations that came from those are all there. Since then, we have focused a lot on the cost of the orders that we are issuing. Often the stakeholder discussions and comments we receive and the discussions at our board meetings are about, have you looked at the costs, and are the costs for these orders commensurate with the benefits of the information that you receive from the monitoring and other analyses that we require. And so the conversation has continued at various levels in all of our program areas. If you attend any of our board meetings, I would argue you at least hear cost of compliance and what have you done to look at costs once, if not a handful of times during a board meeting. So that's kind of the history. There has been some small efforts to reinvigorate the discussion of costs of compliance with the irrigated lands program recently, although this was pre-COVID and we have not met in a couple of years now. Bruce Howdeshelt was convening a group, and I know that Bob also has had some conversations with irrigated land stakeholders around cost of compliance. Just this last fee hearing that occurred back in September of 2020, the board talked a lot about cost of compliance and reinvigorating the conversation, and decided to focus on stormwater cost of compliance as one of their priorities moving into this year. And so I'm going to go over as the first agenda item in this section of the meeting, just the three-pronged project that we have prioritized for the cost of compliance for stormwater. Then I'm going to move to let Bob take over for the second portion regarding costs related to additional funding that has been identified for CDFA, and then a potential model for costs of compliance moving forward. So Bob will take point on the second agenda item. And then Bob will also tee up the third agenda item related to delegated authority and how it relates to cost of compliance. And our Assistant Chief Counsel, Phil Wiles, will talk about what kinds of activities can a board delegate to the executive director or executive officer at a regional board, and what's the process for doing that, and how do stakeholders become aware of those activities. So those are the three agenda items. Unless there's questions, I can't see hands up, so I'm going to rely, hopefully DAS hasn't left the room because they're helping monitor for us. I hope they can monitor any questions. But with that, I'm going to move to the first agenda item and just give an overview of the projects we're working on to look at stormwater costs of compliance. I already mentioned that this came up during the September 2020 board meeting. This is a handout. I'm basically just going to go over the handout that was supplied with today's fee meeting agenda. I mentioned that there's a three-pronged approach. The first is the cost of municipal stormwater permit compliance. The second is using the biotic ligand model to identify site-specific type water quality thresholds for copper and zinc. Formerly, the process for that has been known as water effects ratios. And then the third component is looking at secondary maximum contaminant levels for infiltration and reissuance of the industrial stormwater general permit. So the first one is just generally looking at cost of municipal stormwater compliance. We recently had a state audit of the stormwater program, a component of which was looking at the costs of compliance in our stormwater permits. And the audit recommended or required the state board to develop a guidance document for MS4 permit compliance costs. And our Office of Research Planning and Performance here at the State Board developed such guidance back in December of 2019. It was really a first cut at looking at guidance for cost of compliance for stormwater, and needs to be a deeper dive into the costs. And so we've prioritized our stormwater planning program, our strategy to optimize resource management of stormwater, or our storms staff, to take that guidance as an initial foundation and work from that to bolster it up, both for guidance for a standard accounting and allocation method, to estimate program costs, including, personnel, operations and maintenance, capital improvements, and to differentiate those costs from other costs. So the issue has been that when we ask for costs or get costs from our MS4 permittees, we get them in a variety of formats. We get a variety of costs that are attributed to the stormwater program that may or may not be part of the stormwater compliance costs. And so we need a better set of guiding principles for how to obtain that information from MS4 permittees. And then we also need some guidance for what we do with that information. How do we assess it? How do we use it to modify our permit requirements potentially to address cost of compliance concerns? So we are currently in the process, actually, I think within days, of making an offer to a staff person to join the Storms staff to be the lead on this project. And so you will hear a lot more from Division of Water Quality on the moving forward with this project. We will be including significant stakeholder involvement in both developing and reviewing the documents that come out from this process, both from our steering committees that are stakeholder driven for the Storms program, but also just general workshops across the state to get input. So more to come on that project, actually more to come on all three of these projects. But so that's the first one. The next is looking at developing a statewide inland surface waters plan amendment that will set forth the guidance for developing water effects ratios for metals, in specific copper and zinc. We have a lot of effort going on in the LA region, Region 4, to develop guidance for using what is called a biotic ligand model. It's a model that allows you to collect information from a specific stream that allows you to determine the matrix effects of the stream and the potential difference in toxicity of copper in particular, based on the matrix effects in that stream, rather than going through the full water effects ratio type assessment, which is pretty lab analysis intensive and pretty expensive. So the last water effects ratio site specific objectives that our board approved out of Region 9, the San Diego region, was the Choyas Creek Basin Plan Amendment for copper and zinc. And we were able to approve that amendment, but recognized that we needed more specific guidance for regional boards on how many samples need to be taken, at what locations, and how that information can then be used in the modeling effort rather than the lab analysis to come up with site-specific objectives. I did mention that Region 4's effort is focused on copper, and we are going to build upon the work that they're doing to develop guidance that will apply statewide. And we are also adding zinc as one of the constituents that will be applying this effort to statewide. So that's the second component. The third is related to reissuance of our industrial stormwater general permit. Excuse me, have a little crud in my throat this morning. This one is related to the recent amendments to the industrial general permit, which incentivize use of incentivize infiltration of stormwater and by reducing other types of compliance requirements if a stormwater permittee implements either on or off-site stormwater capture to capture the 85th percentile storm. So we're attempting to incentivize infiltration to reduce the flashiness of stormwater. But what that results in is concerns for groundwater quality, of course. And in particular, there are some constituents that are particularly difficult and to treat, but may not have major impacts to groundwater quality. And those are related to secondary maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. And so we will be looking at those secondary MCLs and evaluating at what levels they need to be effluent limits for infiltration, so we can continue to incentivize improving and increasing infiltration without compromising groundwater quality. So that will be part of the reissuance of the IGP. Just really quickly, I should have mentioned that I already mentioned that we're hiring staff for the first project. And so we'll be starting a concerted effort this year, this calendar year. And then for the industrial general permit, the current schedule is to be working with stakeholders over the next year and a half or so and have a permit ready for release to the public sometime in late 2022, early 2023. And then finally, for the water effects ratios / biotic ligand model implementation project, that one we're working in parallel with Region 4's effort. No planning project takes a short amount of time, so I'm going to guess we're probably around a couple of years out from any amendment to our inland surface waters plan associated with that project. So unless there's questions, I'll hand it over to Bob to take over on the next item. So DAS, do we have questions?
I think Chuck has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. This is Chuck White. Karen, a question about the second item you discussed related to the zinc and
Water.
copper.
Uh-huh.
Is the zinc issue related to the tire issue of sources of zinc? I think the water board just took up a petition to evaluate zinc from tires, and I'm just out of curiosity if that gathers steam, and if tire erosion on the roadways is the source of zinc, does that imply somehow that there would be a fee in charge to people that manufacture tires or anything like that?
So just to be clear, it's Department of Toxic Substances Control that took up the petition to look at zinc in tires as part of their consumer products program.
Right.
So the water board's effort has been related to our stormwater strategy, and part of that strategy is source control, and zinc being one that is particularly problematic in stormwater. Has been a priority in looking at source control. So CASQA, the California Association of Stormwater Quality Agencies, actually submitted the petition and in the hopes that, yes, that there can be some source control associated with reducing the amount of zinc that is in tires. Now, it's the stormwater agencies who bear the costs of the zinc that runs off of their streets and other areas that have zinc. And so it's in their interest to ensure that sources of zinc are controlled to the degree that they can be. So obviously, controlling sources of pollution are much easier than cleaning up pollution once it occurs. Now, for the project that I mentioned, the issue there is at what level does zinc really cause toxicity in a water body? That's what the biggest concern is in terms of water quality. And in some waters, depending on the hardness of the water and other constituents that are naturally occurring in the stream, zinc could be more or less toxic compared to its criteria. And so there may be opportunity to reduce the actually increase the level of zinc that's allowed to be discharged because it's not as toxic due to the natural stream quality. Does that make sense?
It does. And we have about 15 minutes left. So let me intrude, please. This topic, stormwater, is on the agenda specifically because the board members ask us to put it on. There will be a major, as Karen said, undertaking this year. So in addition to thinking about heavy metals and zinc and other topics, think macro, everybody on this call, the impact on point source control, non-point source control, and the costs for your permits. So stay engaged on stormwater discharge. It is, as Karen well knows, a major emphasis to move on very quickly so we can cover everything. And I apologize again. On B, the CDFA BCP. That's about a minute's worth of discussion. What you need to do is, it's on the Department of Finance website. There it is. It's a model for us because the governor himself, this was in his budget address, said we need to reduce the cost burden on farmers. We need to consolidate all of their regulatory permits into an online portal that coordinates them. So look at the BCP. We'll bring it up next time. There it is. But read it. It's a quick read. But the point of this is, I've asked the Water Board to engage on this BCP and talk to CDFA and help coordinate reducing the cost of compliance. But if the governor can engage on this, if we can do a BCP, then we can set up other regulatory reduction models for all of us based on this precedent. So be aware, tune into it, and we'll use it as a model going forward. It's very good for all of us. The last item, our discussion. If you have any concerns, like some of our irrigation district friends do with delegated authority, now's the time to vet them with Karen. Delegated authority, 60 seconds on that. The fundamental concern is transparency and accountability. The board delegates authority to the executive director, who then delegates it to the chief deputy, who then delegates it to the deputies, including Karen. She can't confer this, in some cases, on her assistant deputy directors. Some of our irrigation district friends are concerned because we get into invisibility. Who's got the ball? Why do they have the ball? What's being done with the ball? In other words, is delegated authority getting too micro? Has it become a concern for you? Now's the time. If you've got delegated authority concerns, we're listening. And again, we can't see hands, so just be nice and speak up.
Can we let Phil Wiles give the 2-minute overview?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Really quickly, just to give some context as to what can be delegated and what cannot be delegated, and what the process is and how far down it can be delegated, all of those things. It's very quick, and then we can open it up for any questions.
I apologize, of course. Sorry, Phil. Sorry.
No worries.
No problem, Bob. Thanks, Karen. And I will try to make this quick. Just want to give a little bit of an overview about how delegation works here at the water boards. And you all know this, I think, probably intuitively, but there are different models for government agencies to make decisions. You can look at the water boards. It's clearly it's a board system. You can contrast that with the departmental system. We were just talking about the Department of Toxic Substances Control. They don't make their decisions the same way that the water boards make their decisions. Really, I think it comes down to largely trying to find the right balance between those decisions that involve significant policy issues from those decisions that that don't. We have a very inefficient, but I think a great system for making decisions that involve policy, and that is, all of the discussion, all of the decisions themselves go to a multi-member board. For the state board, 5 members, for the regions, 7 members. They come from a wide background, different areas of life. Obviously, there's an opportunity for the public to address them directly, and they have all of their discussions and they make all of their decisions in public. And that all is the culmination. What the public sees is the culmination of a lot of background staff work to bring those decisions to the board. That's generally what you see. You don't see that kind of behavior at a traditional department. Instead, a decision comes out of sort of a in a letter or occasionally, but rarely, some sort of a public pronouncement. But there's no involvement and no opportunity to see that decision making. Our approach when we go to the board, I don't think there can be any real question. It's pretty inefficient. We can't get as much done. There are additional staff costs that we are then forced to pass on to fee payers just to process the items for the board's consideration. And it takes time. So there are delays associated with making those decisions. So again, really, I think the issue of delegation is probably properly framed in terms of trying to find the right balance. Are we trying to be efficient, get more things done, or are we trying to use a longer process that involves the opportunity for perhaps better ultimate policy-based decisions? So that's sort of the backdrop, and we are constantly trying to evaluate what types of decisions warrant going to the board versus the decisions that weren't being made at the staff level. So the Water Code actually has two provisions that allow for delegation. One is Water Code Section 7, which is a very general delegation statute. It essentially allows any public officer's powers or duties to be exercised by either a deputy or any other person who's authorized by the public officer to exercise those powers or duties. There's also a specific section for the regional water boards. That's Water Code Section 13223, and that's 13223. That's for the regional water boards, and that authorizes the regional water boards to delegate to their executive officers certain functions, not all. In fact, it expressly excludes certain functions that cannot be delegated to the executive officers. The way these statutes are exercised is each of the water boards adopts a formal resolution. In the case of the regional boards, it's typically a single resolution authorizing all of the powers that can be delegated and accepting all of the powers that cannot be delegated by Water Code Section 13223. For the State Water Board, the State Water Board has actually adopted several different resolutions over the years. And some of those resolutions are very specific. They include things like particular administrative duties or tasks under specific programs, things like authorization to enter into contracts or to issue grants. In the water quality arena, there's a specific resolution that was adopted in 2018 that deals solely with the executive director or the chief deputy for water quality or the deputy director for water quality. So all three of those individuals are specifically authorized by that resolution to issue waste discharge requirements for dredge or fill projects. So again, very, very specific, tailored to a particular need where it was determined that it'd be appropriate for that to happen. And then the State Board also has a very general resolution that covers virtually any activity of the State Board with some exceptions. And that's a delegation to the executive director. Now, one of the issues that you raised, Bob, was redelegation. And so in some cases, these resolutions directly address redelegation. In other cases, they don't. And so it does depend in some cases as to what exactly is being delegated and whether there's a specific resolution that's on point that we would be referring to. Because again, some of them do address redelegation and some don't. I will say that for all of the resolutions, at least at the State Board level, there are provisions that direct the designee, or the delegatee, to bring matters to the attention of the board. And without hitting all of them, I'll just mention some of the major ones. I think I just lost my lighting. Sorry, I'm on a motion sensor. Just sort of to give you a quick flavor, these delegations include direction to the executive director to bring to the attention of the board members things that are unique, things that involve significant policy questions, things that are controversial. Oftentimes it'll include things that receive public comment. And so it doesn't, the resolutions don't specify that those items necessarily need to be converted to board decisions. But the process is that the staff will identify issues that meet those characteristics, things that are controversial or involve policy issues. They'll identify them to the board members and may well choose to take them to a board meeting, or may just give the board members a heads up that this is something that they plan on acting on. I will say that even where an item has been delegated, that does not override any of our particular statutory or regulatory requirements for public notice. And so we do provide notice of those items just as though we were taking them to the board, and we solicit comments. It's just that the comments are then considered by the person who's going to be taking the action, rather than considered by the full board at a board meeting. I think that's sort of all of the background I wanted to share. Definitely, I would be curious to know if there are particular items where it's unclear who's acting or how that action is being taken. We may be able to address some specifics, but that's sort of the general overview of how delegation works at the water boards.
Do we have any concerns about delegated authority, those of us who are left?
See a
Sharon
couple
Green
hands
and
up.
then Debbie Webster have their hands up.
Cool.
Okay,
Sharon.
can you hear me? Yes,
Yes.
hi. Sharon Green with LA County Sanitation Districts. I think Phil's explanation was really helpful as a good overview. I just was wondering if he could maybe address what the appeal or petition process is. I'm assuming it's exactly the same, but that might help just add that for stakeholders' benefit.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. That's a great question. So it's exactly the same. Not sure what that means. It's not the same if it's well, again, I'm not sure what the same means. Let me just tell you what it is. So if it's an action at a regional board level that's been delegated to the executive officer, many of you probably know there's a water code provision that allows petitions to the state board, asking the state board to review a regional board decision. And yes, if the decision was taken by an executive officer under delegated authority, the state board absolutely will accept that petition and will review it just as though it was the regional board itself that took the action. I have one caveat, which is that in some cases, the regional board might want to take the first crack at looking at their executive officer's decision. And so it doesn't interfere with the ability or the timing to file a petition, but you shouldn't be surprised if when you do file a petition that on occasion the regional board itself might schedule the item for a regional board item so they can also look at the issue. With respect to actions taken by the state board executive director or other designee, those are treated like actions taken by the state board itself. And so there's no petition process for state board actions. The appeal rights are straight to Superior Court, with one exception. And that is that if the state board has authorized what we call a petition for reconsideration, then in fact, that is a petition process that has to be taken advantage of before you can go to court to challenge the state board's delegated decision. And we have a few, not a lot, but we do have a few of those petitions for reconsideration. The primary one is for water quality certifications issued under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. Those decisions actually do have a regulation that authorizes a petition for reconsideration by the full state board. And so that is an appeal right. And in fact, it's an appeal necessity before challenging a 401 decision issued by staff.
Debbie.
Yeah, so I guess my question to you, Phil, is as you were talking about when the information, these provisions for the designee are brought to the attention to the board. Can you go through more a little bit about the process of that, how that's done, especially because of the ex parte type of stuff that has to, I'm not, excuse me, not ex parte, the core, making sure that there's not a quorum, how the water board works through that, and if there is issues, the best way for stakeholders to get involved.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Good question also. So Debbie's alluding to a Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act concern that we always have to be careful about, which is that we don't ever want to have the board members, actually a quorum of the board, discussing any item that falls within the purview of the board. It doesn't necessarily have to be an item that is going to the board itself, but any of these delegated decisions certainly are within the purview of the board. So we're very careful to not involve a quorum or a majority of the board members in any discussion. So oftentimes, and there's not a set process, I should say, but a lot of times it'll be just a one-on-one conversation between either the executive director or the chief deputy with a single board member, perhaps two, but never three, where it's a sort of a heads up. Hey, we're going to be issuing this 401 certification. There's some controversy associated with it. We don't think it rises to the level where we want to take it to the full board. Just wanted you to know about it. That's often the nature of the conversation. Sometimes it would be a little bit more formal, where we might actually schedule briefings for individual board members. Again, maybe two, never three, where we give them more information. We might even share with them, the specific information that we're hearing from stakeholders, or sometimes from other agencies. And eventually, it's really the decision of the executive director about whether or not to keep the authority and go ahead and make the decision, or to just go ahead and schedule it for a board meeting. And that decision is very, very fact specific. So I'm not sure if I totally answered your question, Debbie, but the short answer, I guess, is it sort of depends on the facts and the nature of the decision. And no question, we sometimes will just say, hey, this one's getting a lot of attention. Let's just take it to the board, because that's in many situations, that's sort of the way that people are most comfortable communicating with the board. You did ask, how else would you get involved if it's not going to the board? Again, we give notice of these decisions, and so a letter to directed where we ask you to direct it. You can also, as long as it's a public letter, you can also send a letter to the board members asking that the board itself take up the decision, rather than having it be exercised by one of their staff, one of their managers.
Paul Pascal, you have your hand up?
Yes, Philip, you went over instances where if there's concerns, protests and whatnot, that could be hopefully address an issue with delegation or the decision of the delegation. And I don't personally see a problem with delegated authority in and of itself. I guess my question relates then more to avoid protests in the first place, to ensure that decisions that are made follow legalities, appropriate processes and whatnot. What type of internal checks and balances there are to avoid concerns with the decision in the first place?
Yeah, so Paul, I think it's going to depend a lot on the type of decision we're talking about. I work in the water quality field, and so I could speak with some knowledge, and Karen could also, about sort of the specific internal staffing process for different types of decisions. I can tell you that at least with the Division of Water Quality, they're in constant communication with the Office of Chief Counsel, and we work really closely to make sure that whatever is going to either the board or to the executive director or chief deputy or to Karen herself for a decision, that we're working closely to make sure that we're, not only following the law, but also trying to be consistent with any policies or even general approaches the board has taken for similar actions. I can't speak to exactly what the process is for other programs, like, for example, the water rights programs or DFA, Division of Financial Assistance, or other programs. Is there a specific type of decision you have in mind?
No, I was just wondering in general. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Any other questions? We've exceeded our time, and I respect your time. It is indeed our most valuable asset. So perhaps we could make this our last without strenuous objection, and if there is one. Sarah?
There are no email questions and I don't see any hands raised. So when you're done wrapping it up, then David will wrap up the whole meeting and we can be done.
Okay, this is the wrap up. If we have any lingering concerns about delegated authority, you have any further thoughts on stormwater, please let me know on the former delegated authority, and Karen on the latter. We will do an informal cost of compliance agenda items gathering, just like we did this time. And I'll, as the ad hoc manager of this, work with Karen and Eric Ekdahl to make sure we keep this on the agenda as long as it's productive, since we've advocated for it for years. Anyway, that's my wrap up. David?
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, Phil, and Bob. Excuse me, as you mentioned, cost of compliance and moving forward, there is a water rights fee stakeholder meeting today at 1 o'clock this afternoon. And there is a cost of compliance agenda item also on that Eric Ekdahl will be discussing. So again, the meeting is at 1 o'clock to discuss the water rights fees. And of course, there's a cost of compliance agenda item on that. Moving forward, just looking at additional meetings, our next water quality fee stakeholder meeting is scheduled for June 10th. And so further information and handouts will be provided to that prior to that meeting. We have a drinking water and an environmental laboratory accreditation program fee stakeholder scheduled for Tuesday, March 9th from 1 to 3 o'clock. And there's also, as mentioned earlier, a Winery Journal Order fee stakeholder meeting. It's scheduled now for March 15th. And so those are the next scheduled meetings. As we mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, you go over the charts on fees, the budget, please reach out to us if you have any questions. Glenn and I or John will be more than happy to discuss. And if you want to do one-on-one meetings, we'll set those up for you. So with that said, again, I want to thank everyone for their participation today. And we'll be talking soon. And again, we'll be having another fee stakeholder meeting at 1 o'clock to discuss the water right fees. Thank you.
Thank you.